Welcome back to episode 6 of the Dr. Beau Show. Tip off. Don't stretch radicular pain. What is radicular pain? That's pain going down your leg or referred pain. Why don't we want to stretch it? So nerves do not have a lot of pliability. They don't stretch a lot. Your sciatic nerve, the biggest nerve in your body, has up to around 3 to 5 millimeters of travel, which isn't a whole lot, right? That's tiny. So when a nerve gets stretched, it's gonna possibly get irritated. So a lot of the stretching sensation you feel when you stretch is neurologic stiffness or tightness. So then imagine a nerve gets irritated due to a disc herniation, an entrapment, whatever it is, and then we try to stretch it, probably going to get worse. So if you're having pain down your leg, try the exercises we're gonna put in the show notes. Some lumbar extensions, some seated sciatic flossing, and some hip external rotations to kind of troubleshoot your pain, see if it gets better, but don't stretch radicular pain. Reminder, Dr. Beau Show is now available on Apple Podcasts. Go subscribe. You can listen to him if you're sick of looking at me, or you just wanna listen to me while you're on the road. Get some good information. So go subscribe now. What I'm reading. So I'm reading Our Wild Calling, and it's how connecting with animals can transform our lives and save theirs. This is by Richard Louv. He wrote The Nature Deficit Disorder, Last Child in the Woods. Very, very good book. It's got a lot of personal stories of people that he interviewed, of interactions with animals that then set them on a different path or gave them a different insight to I guess the rest of their lives. And Richard has a couple of his own stories. He opens the book with a story about him encountering a fox on a trail and kind of looking into this fox's eyes and walking along with him, which rang true with me because I don't know if a lot of people know this. I think this was about 4 years ago. Multiple times when I went out to my local state park here to run, I would be on a trail called the Yellow Trail for my local people, and a fox came out of the woods probably 30 feet ahead of me, ran the whole trail with me. This happened numerous times. I asked a bunch of people that ever saw a fox out there. Nobody else did. But I mean, and to the point where we ran one day probably a mile together on this trail. So kind of cool. And yeah, take that for what it is, right? I'm also reading Travels with Charley in Search of America. And real quickly, I just wanted to read a tiny little excerpt from here that I thought was pretty insightful. And this is by John Steinbeck, pretty good author. So let me start here, and he's talking about how men go through their life as kind of the hero in their family, but then it's like we almost turn back into a child as the man of the house, into the center of we want somebody to take care of us, and he's trying to fight this by the journey he takes with Charley, who is his dog. So I'm just going to read a really short little piece here. So who doesn't like to be a center for concern? A kind of second childhood falls on so many men. They trade their violence for the promise of a small increase of lifespan. In effect, the head of the house becomes the youngest child. And I have searched myself for this possibility with a kind of horror. For I have always lived violently, drunk hugely, eaten too much or not at all, slept around the clock or missed 2 nights of sleeping, worked too hard and too long in glory, or slobbed for a time in utter laziness. I've lifted, pulled, chopped, climbed, made love and joy, and taken my hangovers as a consequence, not as a punishment. I did not want to surrender fierceness for a small gain in yardage. My wife married a man. I saw no reason why she should inherit a baby. The reason I thought that was such a good quote, and I'm just diving into this book, or that little excerpt there, is that's happening to more and more people that aren't even of a certain age, and not just men. That's happening to our youth. And that's kind of, you know, Richard Louv, the previous author that I talked about, has talked about this a lot. Like, we're losing our ability to be an animal, to be a human, by adapting to these digital environments. And yeah, we need to adapt and overcome and move along, but at the same time, if we don't acknowledge where we came from and our wildness and what we're really supposed to be, we have mismatches, and that can create all sorts of issues. What I'm watching, so I don't even know how I found this. I think I found this documentary just perusing through Netflix, and it's called Running Wild, and it's the story of Dayton O'Hyde.
Scientists called me the most dangerous man in American conservation. As a child, I wanted to be a cowboy. I wanted to ride tough. I never have turned down an adventure, so I got on a freight train headed west. I started taking photographs. Here's a photograph I took for Life magazine.
Dayton O'Hyde sadly passed away in 2018, but Dayton was a rancher originally out of Oregon, and then he moved on to South Dakota later on his own. But if you've picked up a couple patterns from me, it's the fact that I really like the story of polymaths. And a polymath is somebody that is highly skilled in multiple areas of their life, or multiple expertise areas. And this guy, on the kind of description of the documentary, it talks about how he was an engineer, a cowboy, an author, a poet, an artist, a conservationist. He did all these things, but he did all these things at very high levels. And extremely interesting guy. I think he wrote over 20 books, more than 20 books. But it's also a bit of a sad story. He just kind of was one of those guys that did his own thing, so that pulled him away from his family, because he decided to move from Oregon to South Dakota on his own to basically start a ranch or a reserve for wild horses that were going to be pushed out by the government and probably given to feedlots. And when we mean by a feedlot, turned into probably dog food. Very interesting guy, very interesting story. I highly encourage you to go check it out on Netflix. And again, that's called Running Wild, the story of Dayton O'Hyde. What I'm listening to. So I got a couple podcasts to throw at you. The first one is The Wild with Chris Morgan. Chris Morgan is a kind of a nature wildlife researcher, and he is out of Seattle, I believe Seattle, maybe Portland, I think it's Seattle. He does this podcast now where he just seeks out very interesting stories about how humans are still living in communal nature with nature, but also just interesting stories. Like the last one was about the hunting prowess of owls. I know that doesn't sound that interesting, but his whole experience is to take these stories that are specific to nature, but then also draw out, well, what's that mean to us? Like, how do we use this stuff? Why is it important? And, you know, and the first thing we need to address there is nature's important by itself, right? We're part of nature and we think we're removed. I mean, I'm sitting here in a building with drywall and artificial lighting around, but we're still part of that ecology, right? Part of that environment. And I just think this show is a very good reminder of that, and a very good storyteller. I think it's very interesting. So check that out, The Wild with Chris Morgan. Also, from the business aspect, actually our real estate agent, we're in a house hunt right now, turned me on this podcast because she is a Keller Williams agent. So this is called Think Like a CEO with Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. They've used this podcast right now. I think they're calling it Pivoting in Business or something like that. But they're talking about how do you use this time of transition during the whole coronavirus scenario to really work on what you should be working on all the time in your business. You know, about staying lean, staying liquid, how do you pivot fast, how to stay in communication and contact with customers. But Gary Keller just has an interesting story. He's written a couple books, started out in real estate straight out of college. Very smart guy, very forward thinking. That's, I think the big thing you can take away from somebody like Gary Keller is that he's always trying to have foresight into what's going on. And then that foresight has allowed him to stay ahead of times like this when they really invested heavily in technology, and times like the Great Recession when they started to decrease inventory and change how they were doing things with their agents at that time. So again, Think Like a CEO with Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. Check that out.
Dr. Beau, what's up, man? Hey, what's your thoughts on reflexive performance reset, also known as RPR?
So that was a great question. So I really, really appreciate that. Now, here's my disclaimer. I have not taken a reflex performance reset class. That being said, you do not have to take every class to understand human anatomy, physiology, neurology, because we went to school. And this is here's a piece of advice for the students out there and even clinicians that are in practice. Anytime you have to trademark something, like you see a lot of TMs on the RPR stuff, something's up. And I hope we learned that from ART. ART was a great concept, right? It's when somebody is an innovator when they just connect dots, right? They connect dots different. And Michael Leahy connected the dots from an engineering perspective, right? He took his expertise over here and said, well, wait a minute, if we apply these science-based for the time, right? The science has changed a bit. Science-based principles to the treatment of musculoskeletal issues will have some success. And I think ART, from a treatment standpoint, is very successful. We still use a little bit of that in the clinic, but from a business standpoint, wildly successful, right? Everybody talks about how, Michael has his own little private jet. But when something is trademarked and you're talking about the human body and using manual tools and movements like that, we have to think about the intellectual property that stands behind these things. So a trademark is very different than a patent. And this is getting into the weeds on this, but this person asked for my advice. So to show that you can get a patent, right, you have to have something that differentiates you. When we talk about the human body, a trademark is allowing you to trademark the name. So what I'd say is you can't own anything in the human body. You can't own a movement, you can't own an exercise. You may have an exercise named after you, like a Brugger's or, whatever, but like you can't own these things. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing to teach a class and get paid for it. That's fine. But then to say things like this, and I'm going to read directly off of the RPR website. And if you don't know what RPR is, go check it out. I'll explain a little bit. But it says RPR is sophisticated enough that it can explain almost every non-contact injury you've ever seen and help prevent them from happening again. That is a huge claim. And I'm telling you right now, the human body is complex. And if you think, again, that rubbing on certain aspects of your body are going to prevent and treat injuries, which we'll get into the next little bit of verbiage that contradicts this, we're already lost, right? We're going to talk about this in the main concept a little bit more, so let me go a little bit further. And then it says, at the same time, RPR is simple enough that a 10-year-old can use it. Complexity of the human body, simplicity of a 10-year-old's use. We're going to tackle all non-contact injuries, and then we're also going to prevent them. This is like magic. Magic don't exist, right? Science exists. And then it says, the best part about the whole RPR system is that the results are immediate, measurable, and quite frankly, almost unbelievable. They should remove the almost. If you're a fan of Dr. Andrew Espina and functional range conditioning, he talks a lot about making these magical, momentary, not long-lasting contributions to the nervous system. And he has a good video where he has somebody lay down, they do a straight leg raise, active passive, and then he says, pick a part on your body, the person picks the earlobe, he rubs the earlobe, gets a little bit better. So this afferent input changes our neurologic output, and the more we do that, the more change we have up to a certain point. And then the last little bit I'll read is, RPR is not treatment for injuries. It is not intended to treat, fix, manipulate, or otherwise replace medical advice and/or treatment. Well, wait a minute. We go back to the first statement. It says it's sophisticated enough that it can explain almost every non-contact injury you've ever seen and help prevent them from happening. So I know the verbiage gets into the weeds there a little bit, but I'm just telling you, it gets dicey here. So I'll give you my 2 cents on this now from my own perspective. I have studied Chapman Points, which Chapman Points are defined as nerve ganglion form contractions. And what that means is where we have ganglion, or where groups of nerves join together, and then sometimes around those ganglions, which is true of Chapman Points, we're also having major lymphatic collection areas, and the Chapman Points have been around since 1920s. And I have a whole book down here with all the Chapman Points listed out, and this came really out of osteopathy. And I tried these for a while in my clinic, and you'll see immediate change. But what we got to realize, like, what are we doing? So let's say I adjust somebody. Here's a really, really good one from a chiropractor. So let's say somebody comes in and they have limited neck rotation, and I adjust CT junction, like C6, C7, T1, maybe T2. We just get, right, get some lateral flexion. And then they turn and they're like, oh my gosh. We could very easily build a narrative on there that we move something back into place. We know that's false. We could also say, man, you were just a little stiff, we had to get the thing moving. That may be true, but what do we also know? It's short-lived. That person doesn't own that because their neurology set them up for this for some reason, right? They may have underlying disc derangement, normal signs of aging or degenerative change. They may have some sort of ligamentous issue, stability issue. And then we use these big, adjusting is a big neurologic input. And research has actually been shown that it actually destabilizes the joint momentarily, so no wonder we would get more movement. So when we talk about like those things, and then we look at something like RPR that supposedly is using these, reflex points, which we, maybe we correlate that to Chapman points. But even when you look at something like DNS, which is heavily influenced by reflex locomotion by Vojta out of the Czech Republic, he uses reflex points where we would say we have some of these same things, these, ganglion form contractions, or they're areas of, like we call them a fascial superhighway. It's where all these fascial lines would interconnect. But really these are areas that allow contact that are driven by where we would have loaded as humans to begin with. So it's a little bit different mindset, but we get really hopped up on those specific positions too. And that's nothing more than we need to load those positions. So all I'm gonna say is, when something's touted as magical, unbelievable, it can cure all these things, like, it's not true. That to me is literally like old school snake oil. Like they stood on a box and they're like, man, take this tincture, it'll solve all your problems. Like, it's just not true. I know you're going to see change, and this is very highly used. I have coaches locally that, we're gonna use it for warm-ups. Here's the big kind of crux of this thing. If I say I have somebody that has a stiff straight leg raise and I rub on a certain area, like, man, look at the straight leg raise improve. Do you think your nervous system is able to use or utilize that new range of motion just because you rubbed on an area? I highly doubt it, right? And I'd love to see their research. I would love to see long-term outcomes, which they may not have yet. But what you're gonna see is it's no different than these neurologic tricks, right? And let's talk about SFMA. And they have these things called stability motor control dysfunctions, where we'd see, man, somebody can't rotate on their own through thoracic spine. I can lift them into that. Now, if we get them to do that immediately, they're probably gonna go right back to how they were unless we give them a reason to change or adapt. Now, let's say we put in a drill like that, which is far more than rubbing on an area typically, and then we train that. Maybe that has, some merit to it. But when we say RPR as a system, which maybe they're backing that on heavy strength and conditioning principles, and that's something I don't know. But I just think when you tout this much stuff, it just can't be true. So I hope that answers your question. I'm not going to discourage anybody from trying anything. Like you got to troubleshoot. Like I've tried a lot of this stuff. And always apply your principally based science, physiology, anatomy, biomechanics, physics, all those things. Does it make sense? Does it jive? If it doesn't, it's probably not true. So there you go. So the main topic of today kind of plays off of that Q&A that we had about, some of these neurologic input type treatments. So it's been becoming more and more common or popular or hot to talk about how, hey, biomechanics don't matter, right? It doesn't matter if you have a valgus collapse in your knee. They're gonna need that valgus collapse. We need to train that valgus collapse, right? Or, hey, you're being too specific on running mechanics. There are people that run a bunch of different ways. It's not the way that they're running. It's, we're hitting a load intolerance. We're creating a sensitivity neurologically. There's a belief about something that's creating pain. All those things are true. But I'm telling you, what I'm seeing is that we're already going back to like the 1970s of physical therapy. Does nobody else see the fact that like we're getting to the point where like, oh, you have knee pain? Just strengthen the things around your knee. Do squats. But now we just say it with fancier lingo. We think we're smarter, right? It's, hey, do isometric holds at a certain angle for a certain amount of time to work on this. Don't worry so much about the mechanics, right? You'll be fine. We're just working on increasing tolerance while we change a pattern. We say that a lot, but mechanics matter, people. There's a reason why we evolved or tried to from PT treatments and chiropractic treatments from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then you see more and more things coming out, searching for more answers to how do we get people out of pain, because those things didn't work, right? You're gonna get 80% of people better just by doing anything. That's the dirty little secret, right? You come into a shoulder pain, I can make you squat. In a couple weeks, you're probably gonna be better, right? Like you can just throw stuff at the wall and it'll work. But what we gotta realize is that how people move over time, right? Are we actually looking at how joints move, how your neurology moves, the quality of tissue? Then we put all those things in there, beliefs. Are we loading certain structures due to how I move overall? But when we start throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, biomechanics don't matter, let's create load tolerance, let's create global strength, let's create movement robustness, sure. But there's a whole reason that you have strength conditioning coaches. And it's not just a program, right? They're programming how to do a squat, how to do XYZ. And then we get into this debate of, well, the mechanics don't matter. Yeah, surely they do. And I know everybody, doesn't, like, it's not this dividing line and we have to, we split the Red Sea and half people are like, it's not that, I get it. But mechanics matter. Let's not be regressive. Let's not repeat history and get into this model of, we're just going to strengthen everything and then we just add our little fancy tweaks. Hey, blood flow restriction, you get, increased growth hormone and boost in testosterone profile by, occluding blood pathways up to 80%. And now we're going to do squats without, working on the mechanics, and think that if we just increase the tolerance of that tendon and decrease the sensitivity, you'll go back to whatever you want to do. Do we really think that's the case? If we do, that's fine. And I know a lot of people will point out, well, more and more people are having more and more musculoskeletal injuries, even though we have all these fancy treatments. That's not a treatment issue. That's an environmental mismatch issue. Did I say issue? I think so. It's an environmental mismatch issue. And what I mean by that is people are having more load intolerances because they don't apply enough load enough times over the long term, right? So we have load issues. People have mechanical issues because they don't move enough. You put those two together, you have a lot more biomechanical or musculoskeletal pathology and injury and pain. And then we see an overwhelming amount of chronic pain because put that into non-athletic populations or people now that have obesogenic issues or other maladies to where they can't move as much as they used to be able to do. And now we want them to get out of pain by moving, and it gets tough. So I just don't want us to be regressive and time travel and go back to this old school, you walk into the PT's office and you're doing quad sets and leg extensions and squats for knee pain. But if you walk into clinics, we're doing kind of that same stuff, just saying it a bunch of different ways and saying, oh, the research shows it's this time frame of loading, and we use this and R&T and all. Like, we're repeating history. Don't be a dum-dum, right? I'm trying to say that as nice as I can, but like, look at somebody, and obviously we can say like, that hip doesn't work like a hip. That hip's got to move better. Now, do you coach movement outside that? Maybe not. Maybe the movement improves because we improve that hip, and that's where we get into a bit of a debate of, can you improve the movement, or should we be worrying about biomechanics, or should we be worrying about something else? Well, what if you have somebody, let's use this example and then we'll wrap up. What if somebody really lacks hip internal rotation? Now they're deviating around their foot and their knee to accommodate for that. But let's say it's beyond the ability to change that hip's range of motion greatly, and they still want to do something like run or walk or cycle, and we know they're just tearing their knee up. The hip immobility or lack of motion or change of mechanics is just tearing their knee up. Maybe, do we not think that we could coach mechanics around the knee to offload the knee? And then what are we doing? We're worrying about biomechanics. So that being said, I know everybody's not in this camp, but I just see this kind of like, strength is rehab movement. And I promise you one thing, if somebody has pain squatting and we think it's not how they're squatting and that we can just create more tolerance by taking them, regressing them and then building their squat back up, like, I don't know, would you not think that like CrossFit would have solved everybody's injuries? Like, and then people would say, well, that's a load intolerance issue, too much, too soon, too often, all that stuff. Well, is it? Then like, we're being hypocritical of our own treatment approaches. So realize, at least from my standpoint, mechanics matter. You look at how somebody moves. We use that as a part of the process, not the entire process. We don't have categories of this is how you move perfect, this is how you have to do it to accomplish a goal. Million different ways. I've talked about this before. As a clinician, you have to adapt to those unique environmental factors that person is trying to adapt to in their life. But let's not be dogmatic and go back to the 1970s and just have people in there with spandex and headbands on doing squats. So before I get off here, again, reminder, you can now listen to this in podcast form. Also look for in the newsletter, if you haven't subscribed, go subscribe, chirofarm.com, subscribe to the newsletter because you'll get all the show notes for this show. Also look for the new blog. Second part of the Age of Movement series, 0 to 6 months, is out. That will be in the newsletter as well as on our website, chirofarm.com/blog. So check all that stuff out. I always appreciate you guys watching. If you have questions, let me know. You can always send them to me at Dr. Beau Beard on social media and drbeaubeard@gmail.com. I hope you guys learned something that makes you better than before.